2:11 a.m., Flint, Michigan. A night shift nurse scans an antibiotic vial. The screen flashes back order. She taps restock. In an instant, the request leaves the ER, travels to the hospital's distributor, then to the pharmaceutical brand, then to the chemical plant producing the active ingredient. The chain extends backwards to the glass vial manufacturer, to the rubber stopper supplier, the container on a ship, and the crane unloading it at a port. At every turn, the origin field resolves to the same place: China. This is not an error in the system. It is the system. A design where American hospitals, retailers, and factories depend on a supply chain half a world away. To understand how a midnight scan in Michigan reaches that far, we must return to the beginning. The story begins in 2001. China enters the World Trade Organization, promising access to its vast labor force and markets. The single event that revolutionized global trade. US corporations quickly moved production overseas. The results were immediate. Imports from China surged fivefold in less than 2 decades, rising from just over $100 billion to more than $500 billion annually. Factories across the American Midwest closed. Entire industries hollowed out. Electronics, textiles, and pharmaceuticals shifted abroad. By 2004, the last US penicillin plant had shut its doors. By the mid-2010s, Apple was assembling nearly every iPhone in Chinese mega-factories. The logic was simple. Production was cheaper, faster, and scalable. But efficiency carried a cost. Supply chains grew longer, more complex, and dangerously concentrated. Then came 2020. COVID-19 shut borders, idled factories, and left shelves bare. Hospitals ran short of antibiotics. Stores rationed electronics. The public discovered how fragile the system had become. Yet, even as cracks appeared, China's role didn't shrink. It only grew. To truly see how far this dependence reaches, we need to begin with 2 pillars: consumer goods and critical industries. Nearly 80% of smartphones imported into the US in 2023 were assembled in China. The same is true for laptops. Apple's iPhone City in Zhengzhou became a symbol of reliance. Even when some assembly moved to India or Vietnam, key components, circuit boards, batteries, casings, still traced back to China. The United States makes less than 5% of the world's printed circuit boards. China produces nearly half. Now look at clean energy. Between 80 and 98% of the global solar supply chain runs through China. From polysilicon to finished panels, more than 3/4 of the world's electric vehicle batteries come from Chinese factories. Even as the US funds gigafactories in Ohio and Kentucky, those plants depend on Chinese cathodes and graphite. Rare earths tell the same story. Over 90% of the magnets essential for wind turbines, smartphones, and fighter jets are produced in China. The US has one rare earth mine in California, but for years its ore was shipped to China for processing. Only recently has Washington begun funding domestic alternatives. And then, medicine. 95% of America's ibuprofen imports, 70% of acetaminophen, and nearly half of penicillin come from China. Even India, the pharmacy of the world, relies on China for 80% of its raw ingredients. When COVID shut Chinese factories, India restricted exports, and US hospitals faced antibiotic shortages. This is the blueprint. From the phone in your pocket to the medicine in your cabinet, American life runs on Chinese supply. But the impact doesn't stop at America's borders. China's dominance in manufacturing is not simply a US problem. It shapes the very architecture of global trade. European automakers rely heavily on Chinese-made batteries and components for their electric vehicles. Without them, production in Germany or France would stall. In Africa, large-scale solar projects designed to expand electricity access often depend on panels produced in China because they remain the cheapest and most available option on the market. In Southeast Asia, factories that assemble goods for export, clothing, electronics, machinery, still import most of their inputs from China before shipping the finished products abroad. This creates a paradox. Leaders across the world talk of decoupling or de-risking, but the reality is that most economies remain deeply tied to Beijing. Supply chain diversification to Vietnam, Mexico, or India is often presented as a solution. Yet, look closer, many of these plants still buy raw materials, circuit boards, or chemical ingredients from Chinese suppliers. The appearance of independence masks a deeper dependency. The ripple effects of this reality are already visible. When China locked down during the pandemic, the slowdown was global. Grain exports faltered, driving food prices higher in the Middle East and Africa. Medicine shipments stalled, forcing governments to ration supplies. Inflation surged across continents, driven in part by disruptions in Chinese production. The fragility of the system was revealed not just in the United States, but worldwide. There are other, quieter signals too. When Beijing restricts exports of rare earth minerals, it's not only American tech companies that feel the squeeze. Defense industries in Europe, Asia, and beyond also face shortages. A single policy decision in Beijing can ripple outward, affecting aircraft production in France, smartphone assembly in South Korea, and renewable energy projects in South America. Dependency on China has therefore become a geopolitical fact. It gives Beijing leverage, economic and political, that extends well beyond bilateral trade with Washington. Countries seeking to imbalance relations with the US and China often find that their own supply chains make neutrality impossible. The question then is how the United States has chosen to respond to this concentration of power, and whether those responses are enough to alter the structure of the global economy. Successive US administrations have tried to counter reliance on China. Under President Trump, tariffs as high as 145% were imposed on Chinese imports, targeting steel, electronics, and consumer goods. The goal was to bring back manufacturing. The result? Some shifts, but also higher costs for US businesses and consumers. President Biden maintained many of those tariffs, adding new restrictions on semiconductors, artificial intelligence chips, and clean tech. In 2024, his administration raised duties on Chinese electric vehicles to 100%. Recent data shows the US now collects more than $80 billion annually from tariffs on Chinese goods. Yet the economic impact is complex. Studies by Yale and the Council on Foreign Relations note that tariffs have cut US GDP growth by about half a percentage point, costing the economy $160 billion annually. Manufacturing has gained in some sectors, but advanced manufacturing has struggled. The US has also strengthened screening of Chinese investments through CFIUS, blocking acquisitions in critical industries. And Congress has funded new projects: the CHIPS and Science Act for semiconductors, the Inflation Reduction Act for clean energy, and Defense Department contracts for rare earths. Still, progress is slow. Building supply chains at home takes years. Meanwhile, the US continues to import from China at historic levels. But what would happen if that flow were to suddenly stop? Imagine for a moment a sudden cutoff. One morning, a shipping container from Shanghai never leaves the port. Then another. Within weeks, electronics stores in the United States begin to ration stock. Consumers wait months for new laptops, phones, or games consoles. Hospitals face deeper risks. Basic antibiotics, ibuprofen, penicillin, acetaminophen begin to run low. Pharmacies scramble to fill prescriptions. Prices spike. Even routine surgeries become more dangerous without reliable medication supplies. The clean energy sector grinds to a halt. Solar farms under construction sit unfinished. Electric vehicle factories struggle to complete cars as batteries remain stuck overseas. Ambitious climate targets built on a foundation of Chinese components suddenly look out of reach. And then there's trade itself. Over 90% of the world's shipping containers are built in China, as are most of the cranes unloading them at American ports. Without replacements, ports slow to a crawl, ships back up at sea, global logistics, already fragile, begins to seize. Alternatives exist: Vietnam, Mexico, India, but most of these suppliers rely on Chinese parts. India assembles generic medicines, but its raw ingredients largely come from China. Mexico exports vehicles, but key electronics inside them are often Chinese-made. Even alternative supply chains loop back, in the end, to the same source. Economists have modeled this scenario. Their findings are stark. A sudden decoupling would cost the US hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Inflation would rise sharply. Jobs in industries dependent on imports would vanish, even as new ones in domestic manufacturing struggled to scale fast enough. For ordinary Americans, it would mean fewer goods, higher prices, and more empty shelves. Globally, the shock would ripple further. European automakers would stall without Chinese batteries. African nations trying to expand solar access would see projects delayed. Southeast Asian economies, many of them reliant on Chinese intermediate goods, would suffer sharp contractions. In effect, the world has built a system that functions only if China participates. And this is what makes the dependency more than economic. It's a geopolitical leverage. Beijing understands that withholding rare earths, medicines, or manufacturing capacity is not just supply chain management, it's a tool of statecraft. The United States and its allies recognize it too, which is why debates over tariffs, industrial policy, and decoupling are not merely economic, they are questions of security. Which raises the final question: can America truly reduce its reliance, or is dependency simply a permanent feature of the 21st century economy? America's economy is built on a backbone it does not fully control. For now, the system continues to function, but each new disruption, a pandemic, a conflict, a policy shift, reveals its fragility. The road ahead is uncertain. Can the United States rebuild fast enough before the next shock? Can allies diversify without collapsing under higher costs? Or will the world remain bound to the factories of China for decades to come? The answers are unresolved. What is clear is that the dependency is not just an economic question, it's a geopolitical reality with consequences that reach every household. Exposing the systems that shape our lives is what we do here at Generation Y. If you want to understand the forces driving global trade, from your phone to your medicine cabinet, subscribe and join us. The next hidden reality is already unfolding.